Chapter 2 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 2. She followed Peter. For a long time the storm had been gathering in her brain, a storm which she had held back, smothered under her unhappiness, so that only Peter had seen the lightning flashes of it. But today the betrayal had forced itself from her lips, and in a hard little voice she had told Jolly Roger, the stranger who had come into the Black Forest, how her mother and father had died of the same plague more than 10 years ago, and how Jed Hawkins and his woman had promised to keep her for 3 silver fox skins which her father had caught before the sickness came. That much the woman had confided in her, for she was only 6 when it happened, and she had not dared to look at Jolly Roger when she told him of what had passed since then, so she saw little of the hardening in his face as he listened. But he had blown his nose hard. It was a way with Jolly Roger, and she had not known him long enough to understand what it meant. And a little later he had asked her if he might touch her hair, and his big hand had lain for a moment on her head as gently as a woman's. Like a warm glow in her heart still remained the touch of that hand. It had given her a new courage and a new thrill, just as Peter's vanquishment of unknown monsters that day had done the same for him. Peter was no longer afraid, and the girl was no longer afraid, and together they went along the slope of the ridge until they came to a dried-up coulee which was choked with a wild upheaval of rock. Here Peter suddenly stopped, with his nose to the ground, and then his legs stiffened, and for the first time the girl heard the babyish growl in his throat. For a moment she stood very still and listened, and faintly there came to her a sound, as if someone were scraping rock against rock. The girl drew in a quick breath, and she stood straighter, and Peter, looking up, saw her eyes flashing and her lips apart. And then she bent down and picked up a jagged stick. "We'll go up, Peter," she whispered. "It's one of his hiding places." There was a wonderful thrill in the knowledge that she was no longer afraid, and the same thrill was in Peter's swiftly beating little heart as he followed her. They went very quietly, the girl on tiptoe, and Peter making no sound with his soft footpads, so that Jed Hawkins was still on his knees, with his back toward them, when they came out into the square of pebbles and sand between the giant masses of rock. Yesterday, or the day before, both Peter and Nada would have slunk back, for Jed was at his devil's work, and only evil could come to the one who discovered him at it. He had scooped out a pile of sand from under the edge of the biggest rock, and was filling 6 grimy leather flasks from a jug which he had pulled from the hole. And then he paused to drink. They could hear the liquor gurgling down his throat. Nada tapped the end of her stick against the rock, and like a shot the man whirled about to face them. His face turned livid when he saw who it was, and he drew himself up until he stood on his feet, his 2 big fists clenched, his yellow teeth snarling at her. "You damned spy!" he cried chokingly. "If you was a man, I'd kill you." The girl did not shrink. Her face did not whiten. 2 bright spots flamed in her cheeks, and Hawkins saw the triumph shining in her eyes. And there was a new thing in the odd twist of her red lips as she said tauntingly, "If I was a man, Jed Hawkins, you'd run." He took a step toward her. "You'd run," she repeated, meeting him squarely and taking a tighter grip of her stick. "I ain't never seen you hit anything but a woman, and a girl, or some poor animal that didn't dare bite back. You're a coward, Jed Hawkins, a low-down, sneakin', whiskey-sellin' coward, and you oughta die." Even Peter sensed the cataclysmic change that had come in this moment between the 2 big rocks. It held something in the air, like the impending crash of dynamite or the falling down of the world. He forgot himself, and looked up at his mistress, a wonderful, slim little thing standing there, at last unafraid before the future, and in his dog heart and soul a part of the truth came to him, and he planted his big feet squarely in front of Jed Hawkins and snarled at him as he had never snarled before in his life. And the bootlegger, for a moment, was stunned. For a while back he had humored the girl a little, to hold her in peace and without suspicion until Mooney was able to turn over her body money. After that, after he had delivered her to the other's shack, it would all be up to Mooney, he figured. And this was what had come of his peace-loving efforts. She was taking advantage of him, defying him, spying upon him, the brat he had fed and brought up for 10 years. Her beauty as she stood there did not hold him back. It was punishment she needed, a beating, a hair-pulling, until there was no breath left in her impudent body. He sprang forward, and Peter let out a wild yip as he saw Nada raise her stick. But she was a moment too slow. The man's hand caught it, and his right hand shot forward and buried itself in the thick, soft mass of her hair. It was then that something broke loose in Peter. For this day, this hour, this minute, the gods of destiny had given him birth. All things in the world were blotted out for him except one, the 6 inches of naked shank between the bootlegger's trouser leg and his shoe. He dove in. His white teeth, sharp as stiletto points, sank into it. And a wild and terrible yell came from Jed Hawkins as he loosed the girl's hair. Peter heard the yell, and his teeth sank deeper in the flesh of the first thing he had ever hated. It was the girl, more than Peter, who realized the horror of what followed. The man bent down, and his powerful fingers closed around Peter's scrawny neck, and Peter felt his wind suddenly shut off and his mouth opened. Then Jed Hawkins drew back the arm that held him as he would have drawn it back to fling a stone. With a scream the girl tore at him as his arm straightened out, and Peter went hurtling through the air. Her stick struck him fiercely across the face, and in that same moment there was a sickening, crushing thud as Peter's loosely jointed little body struck against the face of the great rock. When Nada turned, Peter was groveling in the sand, his hips and back broken down, but his bright eyes were on her, and without a whimper or a whine he was struggling to drag himself toward her. Only Jolly Roger could tell the story of how Peter's mother had died for a woman, and in this moment it must have been that her spirit entered into Peter's soul, for the pain of his terrible hurt was forgotten in his desire to drag himself back to the feet of the girl and die facing her enemy, the man. He did not know that he was dragging his broken body only an inch at a time through the sand. But the girl saw the terrible truth, and with a cry of agony which all of Hawkins' torture could not have wrung from her, she ran to him, and fell upon her knees, and gathered him tenderly in her arms. Then in a flash she was on her feet, facing Jed Hawkins like a little demon. "For that I'll kill you," she panted. "I will! I'll kill you!" The blow of her stick had half blinded the bootlegger's one eye, but he was coming toward her. Swift as a bird Nada turned and ran, and as the man's footsteps crunched in the gravel and rock behind her, a wild fear possessed her, fear for Peter, and not for herself. Very soon Hawkins was left behind, cursing at the futility of the pursuit and at the fate that had robbed him of an eye. Down the coulee and out into the green meadowland of the plain ran Nada, her hair streaming brightly in the sun, her arms clutching Peter to her breast. Peter was whimpering now, crying softly and piteously, just